and kick off this webinar today. Thank you for attending. It's a bit of an odd time, so we might have people join as we go. It's to facilitate a very early start in the UK for Stephen, so thank you for getting up bright and early and helping us with this webinar. So yeah, it's been a very big year for Charge Together program, and thanks for everyone who's helped along the way. Obviously Electric Vehicle Council, ARENA, Ausgrid, NRMA, South Australian Government, New South Wales Government. Yeah, it's been a really great year, a lot of energy from everybody. I'm Dan Hilson, founder of Evenergi and also the chair of the Charge Together program. And today we've got a really exciting topic that I think is top of mind for lots of people. And the question, I guess, with a lot of announcements that have come out from ACT government and New South Wales government and Brisbane City Council, and lots of pilots going on in ACT and Nowra and with transit systems, is 2020 a big year in Australia for at least one part of the sector, which is buses? And I think, it's fair to say that it's extremely important and not only a good economic opportunity and something that can be, within the reach of economic paybacks, but it's also extremely important. It plays into the fact that transport decarbonisation, public transport, it's not all about electric vehicles, it's obviously about the full future decarbonisation of transport. And I guess in the, the emergency that we find ourselves in, these things are incredibly important. And it's also a very visible way that the community can see action on climate change. So without too much more, I'll hand you over to Gareth from Transgrid, who's going to go through some high-level information about the space and what Transgrid is doing, and then we'll hand over to Stephen, who will go into a bit more detail about the experiences that he's had and in the UK market. So thank you both for participating, and I'll hand over to you now, Gareth.
Thank you. Electric buses are, something that's definitely on the forefront and is going to be coming to the market. So it's a great thing to be talking about today. We've had a look at EVs from a grid perspective, but what we're looking at today and what we see is a growing segment is the commercial electric vehicle fleet market. And from this graph, you can see already quite clearly the share of new EV sales by segment, and buses are really already at over 50%. This primarily is coming from the Chinese market, but it's really an indication of what's to come, we think, across the world. And some of the key drivers that are driving this uptake in electric buses is the depot-based charging, which is where you have a lot of you would know about this, but it's a hub-based fleet model, and it means that you don't have to rely on distributed charging units, across a network. You can just have them all placed in one spot for economies of scale, and it also solves a lot of the range problems which passenger vehicles might have when you're trying to find a related charging unit on your journey. The second big driver we're seeing in terms of commercial electric fleets is the economics of it is a big one. With a passenger vehicle, obviously, you do your certain miles, which is around 15,000 kilometres on average per year. But when you're looking at buses and other commercial fleets, you're talking upwards of about 50,000 kilometres per year. So just on usage alone, you're going to see the economics of switching to electric move the dial quite a bit. In the bus segment, we're seeing that there'll probably be a lot of large segments switch over, or large depots. So it's going to be quite lumpy. It's not going to be a gradual transition that you'll probably see in the passenger fleet market. And that's quite interesting for all networks and grids involved, because you're going to see a big increase in load in one part of your network. And so you really need to understand how that's going to play out and what are the best ways to alleviate those concerns that might come from a large electrification. In terms of the commercial or light commercial, medium commercial, primarily the light commercial line, the blue one, that's probably going to be led by depot-based commercial fleets rather than non-depot fleets, but that's just something to be mindful of. So as Dan mentioned, councils, governments and the private sector, there's been a lot of announcements coming out, and it's just a sign that the economics of this is making a lot of sense, and also the environmental drivers behind this are meaning that there's another reason to push electric buses and electric commercial fleets. On the ACT side, up in the top left corner, I mean, they've already announced that they're looking for another 84 buses that immediately in the next upcoming years to be electric. You've got New South Wales government in the bottom right talking about 8,000 buses. In the article, they said Sydney's 8,000 buses, but it's actually about 5,500 in Sydney. And that's huge. Like if some of the depots in Sydney are 500 buses plus, and so that's a serious consideration for the grid that we need to think about. In terms of other commercial fleets, you're seeing Cleanaway with electric rubbish trucks. We're also seeing fire trucks being electrified. And in the bottom left, you've got IKEA segments, obviously switching its fleet delivery vehicles over to electric, and that's also echoed by other companies around the world, such as Amazon, who've got 100,000 electric vans on order. And you're also seeing La Poste in France, who've ordered 35,000 EVs. So when you look at the typical activities in a, say, electric bus operation, you've got that up the top, which is your diesel or CNG fleet. But when we switch into the electric world, there's a whole new raft of activities that are required, and that's highlighted by these orange sections. And these are areas which, for the past decades, bus operators and fleet owners haven't had to consider at all, and now they are starting to grapple with how do we deal with this new world where we've got electricity and electricity contracts to manage, rather than just in the diesel world. So if we go through this, we've got there's a lot of work up front to understand what's the grid constraints, what are the charges that we're going to use, what's the charging profile. There's different ownership models now coming out, and Stephen will talk more about this, but because you've got now an electric battery on the bus, and you've got the bus body, and they've got different life cycles, how do you manage those two different life cycles, and how do you recycle the bus battery? Moving into the area that I've circled in the configuration of the depot. Now this is an area we're interested in, obviously, because it can have quite a lot of impact on the grid if not done right, but it can also, for fleet owners, be costly and time, and take quite a lot of time to do if it's not done right. And there are ways in using technology, which Stephen will probably go into later, with on-site batteries and solar, where you can alleviate a lot of those grid concerns and actually not treat the depot as a problem for the grid, but actually it can be used to support the grid in times of need or in areas where it's weak. We've got design and optimize routes and timetables. That's what's different about that, is you need to now think about the charging requirements and how that fits in with your routes that you're doing, because now you can't just come back whenever and just fill it up in 5 minutes with the diesel. You really need to consider what is the peak hours in terms of the grid, in terms of the cost for electricity, and how does that fit in with your timetables and also your staffing timetables. And then at the end of this process, you've got managing electricity contracts, which is very different to diesel. And there's also a lot of benefits or potential upside that can be had if you've got someone who knows that market quite well. And as I mentioned before, planning the battery renewal and disposal process. So bus operators don't want to be left with just a battery halfway through, 7 or 8 years in. They probably just want to run and operate the bus. So it's important to consider that up front. What is happening to that battery on the bus? How can it be repurposed and not just go into the landfill? And there are a lot of interesting ways. Again, Stephen has in Zenobe have done a bit of work on this, where you can repurpose that battery for use on other bus depots. So as I mentioned, one of the big impacts, which a lot of people talk about the electric buses and understanding, okay, I know the bus works and I know that there's some charging equipment, but the grid side is really overlooked. We've seen in talking to people. For example, one large depot I've said here could be in the order of over 50 megawatts. And depending on the number of vehicles and obviously the charging profile, but that's a serious number. And without considering the impact and the ways that you can manage this, it can be very costly. But as mentioned, there are ways around this, and I think this will come out later in the webinar. Another area which we've seen people talk about is the space constraints and the grid limitations on brownfield sites. Now, not every, in fact, most bus electrification projects will be done on brownfield sites because there's not a lot of land. So there's going to be the need for some innovative ways to manage the charging equipment, and if you're using on-site solar and storage, to be able to work within your current constraints. And the last point which I wanted to touch on was obviously there's a meaningful impact on the environment, and I won't go through all these sort of interesting facts, but it's an important driver, not just because obviously it is good to improve the environment, but this driver is coming through for councils and governments to turn to electric buses as well. So if they're setting emissions reduction targets, then buses are an economic way to actually meet these targets quite quickly. Because the utilisation is high, because there are savings in terms of operational and fuel replacement savings, you can also meet your environmental targets and actually save money along the way. So that was all I was going to talk about, and I think you'll enjoy hearing from Stephen and what they've learned in the UK market.
Great, thanks very much, Gareth. That was really interesting. And I should have mentioned, if people do have questions, just ask them in the chat box. Let us know who you are and where you're from, and we'll ask at the end those questions. So we'll hand over to Stephen. Thank you very much for getting up early and keen to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Dan. Just quickly share my screen. Right. So yeah, thanks everyone. From our side, very excited to be here and share a bit about our learnings from participating in the journey of electrification in the UK. So, can everyone see my screen actually?
Yep, perfect.
Oh, for some reason it doesn't want to go to the next slide. Yeah, I'll do it like this because when I go into presenting mode, for some reason it doesn't want to skip to the next slide. Just a bit of background on us. We're an energy storage owner and operator. We stumbled into the fleet market, I would say almost by accident, because we were trying to solve grid bottlenecks for large industrial users, and then quite quickly realized there is a need for future large energy users to tackle some of the challenges there that Gareth was referencing earlier. But let's skip over that. What we're doing in a lot of cases is actually, rather than looking at a traditional grid upgrade as Gareth was referencing, is looking at alternative solutions to actually study what is the amount of power you actually need based on your schedules. How can we smoothen that power profile with smart charging? and as a result reduce the need for a grid upgrade and potentially augment your existing grid connection with a small energy storage device that would then effectively cover the gap between the grid limit, the sort of blue line, light blue line, and the power requirement, the dark blue line, and then supply that energy amount here in the middle colored yellow. The other element that's important on the EV side we've noticed is obviously electric vehicles are still expensive. There is a large upfront cost, and the infrastructure element there is often overlooked. We have seen projects here in the past where people have bought vehicles that then sometimes turn out to be slightly more challenging to operate in the location they intended. And fixing things retroactively is often more expensive and time consuming than when you sort of look at it holistically up front and think, how are we going to pull everything together? The other element with the grid infrastructure is that in a lot of cases, it is an expensive asset that you are using relatively limited, because for instance, with buses, they're often charging at night, and then the rest of the day that grid connection is unused. So again, thinking from a fleet ownership mentality, how do you utilize that asset more? Again, with the small stationary storage device, you could potentially then start participating in ancillary services markets to effectively recuperate some of that investment, or store on-site solar generation from the rooftop, which in the UK is obviously slightly more limited potential than what could be done in Australia. But that is an alternative way of tackling the energy upgrade challenge. So just some pictures here from one particular site. This is a park and ride in Guildford, just outside of London. And as you can see, we've got, well, they had their on-site energy supply coming in the bottom right corner, the sort of green box. And then we placed a slightly smaller box behind that, which is a sort of battery. And just to give people some ideas of some numbers, these are AC chargers, 9 vehicles, typically charging at about 80 kilowatts. The incoming feed was about 200 kilowatts, and the battery storage device is about 500 kilowatt hours. And now if you sum that all up, you say 9 times 80 versus 200 kilowatts, obviously there's a gap, but in this case, even the battery is slightly smaller than that gap. And that is by understanding the route schedules and how we can flatten that power curve. We can still sort of guarantee every morning that those buses will be charged on time. And I think that's really important to consider as you do a phased electrification. How are these the mileages that you're doing and the schedules that you're running, how do these interact with each other on your initial routes that you might electrify versus what you're doing further down the line? So some pictures here again, because we talked about smart charging. Obviously, software is very important in terms of trying to understand what is happening in your depot at night. How are the vehicles getting charged? Are people plugging them in on time? Are electric vehicles not stuck in the queue for the refueling station together with diesel vehicles? And how do you get them to a charger as quickly as possible? If I actually briefly go back, this is a very simple layout. All the buses are sort of parked up straight to a border. Now, as you go into more urban environments, the traffic plan and the layout can actually be quite an important consideration in terms of making sure you get vehicles to a charger as quickly as possible and back out without sort of impeding the flow of diesel vehicles that might be needing to get out as you're operating a mixed fleet, perhaps in the sort of initial stages of electrification. We can also talk a bit about AC chargers. Actually here, AC chargers are one technology. What we are seeing in the UK, particularly within London, is people are starting to move towards DC charging and actually starting to use that as the sort of to be standard. That's also coalescing around the sort of standards for passenger cars, so CCS charging in Europe, and CHAdeMO in some of the more Eastern markets. Now, why would you put a battery there? we sort of looked at it in different ways. The first thing is obviously you need to meet your EV charging speed. The elements is cost. Now, in some cases, you can get more grid. So one of the things that we're always discussing with our customers is always understand how much supply have you got at each of your depots, and can you get more? Because with grid supply, as Gareth mentioned, even small changes can have a huge impact on the grid. And it's always sort of the last kilowatt that causes the issue. Do you need a transformer upgrade because you want 101 kilowatts rather than 100? And if you go above that transformer limit, something else further upstream in the system could then become the bottleneck, et cetera, et cetera. And it's how do you move between those successive bottlenecks in a way that minimizes the cost or dilutes that cost over the maximum number of vehicles. Time is another consideration. We've seen projects here in the UK where sometimes grid upgrades could take more than a year, and where actually some vehicles have ended up being charged by diesel generators, charging EVs to then go on the road, which is not a great story for anyone. So again, these understanding and working with your network operator to understand what the network constraints are, how you plan around them is very important. The other element on the future-proofing side, so obviously if you make an investment in a substation, you don't want to have to rip that out in 5 years and put a new and larger one in. So making sure it's expandable is very important, and planning ahead with that side of things. Movability. The other thing with the storage side, if I go back to the picture here, what you can see, those batteries, I mean, they're basically attached to a small base foundation with about 12 bolts effectively, which means it's actually quite portable. And that was quite an important consideration for Guildford, because it was discussed with the council that it's actually quite likely that depot will have to move in the sort of next 5 years. And with a substation, well, you have to leave that behind for whoever's next. It becomes sort of part of the the fixture, basically. But in this case, we can actually guarantee to Stagecoach that they can take that with them, so it's not a sunk cost, which is again helpful for them. We already talked about the ability to generate income with the battery during the day, and then also, from a financing perspective, we're seeing new ownership models coming in, but I'll talk a bit more about that later on. If I briefly jump ahead to sort of other areas where we're seeing interesting aspects to keep in mind. First off, the regulatory environment here in the UK. So for instance, obviously a lot of the EVification is driven by congestion pricing, road pricing, or emission zones, but is then somehow counteracted in some markets by fuel subsidies, where people can get tax rebates on as an industrial user of diesel, which then often sometimes impedes the economic business case. Speaking of that economic business case, grants aren't everything, and that's probably a provocative thing to say, because who doesn't like free money? The challenge that we've seen with grants is that sometimes with the grant process, it's quite challenging for the regulator or the supporting entity to manage timelines. Things can slip, and sometimes restrictions. It's hard for them to sort of plan and let people be innovative without making the grant too wide. And that's, again, something that we're seeing the various regulators, Department for Transports in various countries struggle with. Bus first, infrastructure later, I think was touched on already. Plan ahead, you need a holistic approach where you say, okay, this bus with this charging profile and this schedule, how does that impact my infrastructure, and what infrastructure do I have, and how can that influence potentially my choice of vehicle even? And how do I coordinate between all the different stakeholders, the network operator, the energy supplier, various subcontractors, et cetera, or are there parties out there that can provide a full end-to-end solution to the whole problem? Briefly moving on the bus, what's in a warranty? We're seeing huge differences between the different bus manufacturers in terms of what is actually in that warranty and what can actually be enforced. How many cycles can that do? Are there restrictions on average depth of discharge, et cetera, and how does that match your route profile is, again, very important to consider. investment horizon and payback perspectives. I mean, again, here in the UK, we've done now about 110 buses ourselves, which is sort of and if you look at the UK market, it's about 300 vehicles. There's other countries in Europe that are further ahead, and obviously China is much further ahead. But the payback perspectives differ quite a lot. We've seen from operator to operator, but also from country to country. So a lot of cases driven by mileage. Obviously, the more mileage, the more operational savings. Getting a handle on what the exact O&M savings are, and getting commitments from the manufacturer around defects per or maintenance events for every 10,000 kilometers also factors into that calculation. And that's easier to do if we see actually in the rural markets rather than the urban markets, because typically their routes in the UK are commercial, so the operator is private and runs those routes themselves. While in franchised environments, you often see a shorter term horizon and a slightly different desire for a different ownership model, because, well, every routes need to be retendered for every 5 or 7 years. And how do you marry that with suddenly having to buy a vehicle that's more expensive in the upfront, but cheaper in the long term? Fleet versus route. We're seeing some, I've briefly skipped the one, but the fleet versus route one is again an interesting one. We're seeing some operators looking at this as a let's electrify route by route, which is, for instance, the case in London. But in some areas like the West Midlands and others, people seem to operate more for a blended route strategy, by actually saying, if we look across our running boards, what are the vehicles with the sort of range within the sweet spot, meaning enough miles to have substantial savings, not too many miles so they feel comfortable with the range, and sort of mesh vehicles in around the diesel, which is again quite interesting. DC versus AC versus multi versus pantograph. The choice of charger, again, a huge implication, because how you park up your vehicles, if you have a mix of AC charging, DC charging, and pantograph, planning how your vehicles move around can be quite challenging because they're not always cross compatible. And the charging speeds have huge impacts. We're seeing pantograph and opportunity charging being used in some locations. And when the routes then change, that's quite challenging. And as Gareth touched on, every grid connection you need will have an impact on the grid. And you can therefore again end up in a situation where, certain timelines to achieve that capacity, and particularly the peakier the profile, it's again very important to consider storage as an alternative to bring that upfront cost down, but also the running costs. Where to electrify first? Again, we talked about, briefly coming back to that, do you go after low-hanging fruit, or do you maximize savings? Typically, we see people there sort of consistently taking a middle ground. With the alternative ownership models, briefly talking about some of the things that we are doing, but there's other players doing the same in the US, by actually saying, well, why do you want to buy all the charging equipment? Is it possible to have a partner who says, well, actually, we'll guarantee the vehicles are always charged, finance everything, and then come up with the best cost solution on a sort of cost per mile basis, and also do that for the battery on the vehicle, so that you effectively have an end-of-life solution for that battery when it comes off. And secondly, you have cost certainty over the full life of the vehicle in a sort of, again, fixed price per kilometer. The end-of-life element we're seeing in certain markets come very much to the fore. Certain US tenders, and same in France and other places, if you want to tender for an electric route, you need to show you have an end-of-life solution. People don't want to see batteries ending up in landfills, etc., etc. Sharing costs. I spoke earlier about the different types of chargers. We are seeing councils in particular try and take advantage of spreading the infrastructure cost over as many users as possible, and looking for coordination between their refuse trucks, their buses, their grey fleets, to then share the cost of those chargers. Now, obviously, the challenge with that is HS&E. How do you manage different people coming in a depot? Can you do that on a brownfield side, or do you move things to a sort of new charging hub? So I've seen a lot of people talk about this. I haven't seen it get implemented yet, but it does obviously offer potentially rather substantial savings if, again, you can sort of coordinate across all the stakeholders. So yeah, these were just a few points of things that we're seeing here in the UK. Yeah, forward to any questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. That was really interesting, and thank you again for getting up early. I know it's very early over there, and sharing all those insights. So I will go to questions. If people want to type any questions in, it's obviously a little bit of a specialized space, so maybe a little bit more difficult for people to ask specific questions. But certainly, I will kick off. So I guess one of the things is around the balance between kind of the weight of these batteries and the right sizing of weight versus opportunity charging. And have you sort of seen any or had any experience in terms of the different sort of battery configurations and what the best sort of balance of that has been?
Well, if maybe I go first. We have seen different manufacturers take different strategies. So if we go for certain manufacturers opting for larger batteries to get around the range anxiety or the perception around range anxiety, and typically go for sort of iron phosphate technology. We have seen other manufacturers actually go towards the other end of the spectrum and actually say, well, how can we make the body as light as possible and also make the battery as light as possible so we get the most energy efficient vehicle per kilometer, and as a result need smaller batteries, which then often end up going for either a nickel manganese cobalt or a sort of lithium titanate oxide technology. So I would say both strategies are out there in the market, and again it depends on your route. Do you have weight restrictions? Do you have to go over certain bridges? Are there height restrictions, etc., etc.?
I guess it's just an extension of that, which is a bit up there. But I mean, I know in Korea battery swapping is still a thing in buses. Is that something that you've experienced anywhere else, or is it really not propagated?
Sorry, the line broke up briefly. Could you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I know that in Korea and some places battery swapping for buses is still occurring. Is that something that you've seen and experienced, or do you think that's not going to be one of the core technologies?
In the UK market, that's quite challenging with the whole low flooring design in terms of actually getting the skeleton to sort of grab that battery, take it out, put it back in again. The mileages are also quite high, so you'd end up swapping quite a few batteries per vehicle at the moment. And on top of that, the batteries with the different manufacturers are all in different locations. So there is a bit of vendor lock-in when going for swapping situations. We have seen that actually in the Indian market. There's quite a few. There is a manufacturer there that's using that.
Great, thank you. Julia has asked, have you seen successful models where a third party is providing charging infrastructure and batteries for a cost kilometre to the operator?
Well, I hope this doesn't sound too self-promotional, but that's effectively what we're doing for about 109 buses across 3 different OEMs in the UK. We're now doing about 6 depots that we manage completely as a service. So we are funding the charging infrastructure. We've done the full design together with the operator, and we charge it on a pence per kilometer. The cents per kilometer is also subsidized a little bit because we can get grid income from the battery assets during the day. And then on top of that, we're also lowering their energy cost by feeding in some solar and guaranteeing renewable power. And we are battery swapping, well, not swapping as a day-to-day basis, but we're guaranteeing range for the next 15 years by effectively doing a battery replacement over the course of the vehicle's life, and then repurposing those batteries in our second life application. So we've actually haven't fully publicly announced this yet, so I won't mention names, but we're doing a project where we're actually using old bus batteries in a new bus project. So we're actually not putting those old batteries on new buses, but we're putting those old bus batteries in a depot to unlock additional grid capacity to then enable the charging of new electric vehicles, which we're obviously quite excited about. There's an example with Proterra and Mitsui in the US as well. So we're not the only ones offering this, but it is, various people are experimenting with those models.
And what are you seeing are the sort of tipping point in economics? Like, what's the payback period that people are looking at as realistic and are accepting in these projects at the moment?
I would say it's further out than 5 to 7 years, which is often a challenge for given the length of contracts we're seeing in Europe. But when you sort of go towards the 10, 12, 15 range, there are it is definitely a positive NPV sort of decision if when done right. And the other element is what is the life of an electric bus? I mean, in a lot of cases, that's still to be seen, but there's less wear and tear, there's less components in a bus. So the question is, could it actually result in running the vehicle longer? Because also once it's zero emission, it's not that you will be upgrading your fleet continuously for the new Euro 4, 5, 6 or whatever standard. So that's another important consideration in these sort of total cost of ownership over the entire life calculations. Does that help?
Absolutely, yeah. Someone's asked here, Tom Morris, do you see any advantages to charging overnight, particularly with respect to wind PPAs, power purchase agreements?
Well, I think, and again, and this is in the UK market, there are also price differences during daytime and nighttime. In terms of fully sleeved PPAs with wind farms, have not seen those. However, for instance, commenting on what we are doing and what some other players in the market are doing, not just for buses, but for sort of large corporates and data centers, is trying to match wind, solar, biomass, pumped hydro, and sort of bundling that all up to sort of guarantee a renewable energy mix to their customers. We're definitely seeing that happen. And there are opportunities to take advantage of negative pricing or low pricing. For instance, in the UK last weekend, prices went negative for an extended period of time. So managing, again, that charging profile that I showed earlier and having control over those chargers is incredibly important, because it's all cents and pences, depending on your currency of choice. But it does add up when looking over a 15-year horizon on a fleet of over 100 vehicles. And that's, again, sort of again, sorry for being slightly self-promotional, is that's, again, part of the service that we're sort of offering to our customers, because we're already managing a large fleet of batteries, about 75 megawatts. So adding on a few charges here and there, we can have a whole team looking at that and optimizing that.
Great, thank you. I don't know, Gareth, did you want to add anything to that particular point in terms of the balancing the grid?
Yeah, I think it's important. There are CNI-based retail. We are obviously not a retailer, but there are retailers out there offering services for this type of model, where you can look at getting exposure to the wholesale market if you think that you have the supporting solar and on-site storage to be able to manage that risk, and then you might be able to actually have a better solution. Or we've seen that there are obviously fixed price contracts out there as well. So I think there's a range of different pricing models for electricity that can be assessed and worked in with what technology you have on site and what your charging profile is, also matched up with the relevant grid charges that you might have. So yeah, I think there's a bit of analysis upfront that's done, but there's a lot of options as well.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of different sort of related questions here around, is it sort of opportunity charging an opportunity? Is it all going to be done at a depot? Are there sort of opportunities at the end of a route or at different points of a route to do charging? Are there any thoughts that you guys have had around those alternative kind of charging strategies?
Gareth, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, we've in speaking to a lot of bus operators and OEMs of buses, the range that they're getting at the moment is pretty extensive, in the order of 450 kilometers on one charge. So whilst opportunity charges can play an important part if you're needing that, a lot of the operators are seeing that they don't need that, and they're only using about 50% of the battery before it gets back to the depot, and then can be just topped up. So whilst there is that option, the technology is there at the moment to get them through the whole day quite easily.
Great, Stephen. So were you going to say something? Was that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are good points. I think one place where we have seen a lot more opportunity charge being deployed, and again, the market is sort of, I don't want to focus on particular countries or anything, but in the Netherlands, we do see quite a bit of opportunity charging, for instance. And obviously the challenge is there is that you have multiple grid connection points. So trying to get that through and planning in an urban environment can be challenging. But they've opted for opportunity charging there because it's a 24/7 operation. So things going back to base is difficult. And secondly, they're operating their vehicles across routes. So being able to sort of swap back and forth is quite important. And the number of vehicles that they have makes it possible to sort of always have a certain number of vehicles on the road, and then a few quickly grazing sort of along the way whenever their battery drops below a certain SOC. So the choice of charger then again does have a huge impact on what is your operational strategy during the day.
Great. Again, a couple of related questions here around, I guess, hydrogen, in that if there is a 50 megawatt connection and it just becomes unfeasible, is there sort of an argument for hydrogen in some of these cases? And, what's your sort of position generally on hydrogen as opposed to electric bus?
I'll start. I think that there's, I feel like from what I've seen in the market that there is, it's more a progressed or mature market in the electric space, and we've developed, countries around the world developed pretty sturdy grids and networks that can be utilised, and if we can continue to utilise that in a positive way, I think that's good rather than sort of creating a new distribution network of hydrogen. But that being said, I think hydrogen is definitely the focus of a lot of organisations, and I think it can play a role as well alongside electric. You could have electric. I know there are some places actually doing electric and hydrogen at the one depot. So it'll be, who knows how it will play out over the next 5 to 10 years. But I definitely think there's a lot more momentum at the moment behind electric than hydrogen.
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what Gareth's saying, but if we look at, for instance, again, sort of say you take all the routes in a particular area and you sort of sort them across various criteria, then what we've seen in the UK is that today you might end up with a mix of sort of 20% hydrogen, 80% electric, and doing that ranking in the UK or giving you such results, you might have very different results when you do that in other markets. The other element there is having access to cheap supply. So for instance, in areas like sort of the Benelux, you've got a huge petchem space that uses a lot of hydrogen or produces a lot of hydrogen. So from that perspective, tapping into that is a lot easier. While in other places, the electricity net is slightly more prevalent. So it's more easy to tap into that. It's again comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier about taking a holistic approach and saying, well, based on what I'm doing or planning to do, start planning early and having those conversations about, well, is there a grid supply available? Where would I get my hydrogen? How do I manage that sort of future proofing? And for instance, if you're running multiple depots, are you actually going to end up with that 50 megawatt requirement in one depot? ? And what are the bottlenecks in the local area?
Great, thank you. I mean, there's a couple of quite technical questions here. I guess one of them is around summer, winter kind of energy consumption. So is there a significant difference based on seasonality in terms of the performance of these buses and related batteries?
Well, I would say the energy efficiency is going to change depending on whether you're in a climate that needs lots of heating or that needs lots of air conditioning. So there are differences. and managing that is again quite important, because it has an impact on the energy consumption of the vehicle and potentially range, and not necessarily as much on day one, but particularly featuring into any sort of battery replacement strategy over the life of the vehicle. It's very important to plan that in. Road traffic is again another factor, because if vehicles can get stuck in traffic for extended periods in a very unpredictable manner, and you need to continue to air condition or to heat, that can have quite an impact in certain markets.
Right. Well, yeah, quite a technical one here, but I will ask it. What's the load factor of an EV bus depot connection with and without on-site battery support?
That's actually a very good question, and I might not have touched. I might have mentioned with the Guildford example. We had sort of a 200 kilowatt connection, and with the battery. Normally, they would have needed about 800 kilowatts to a megawatt. So from that perspective, it's sort of a factor 5. But they have a relatively large charging window. Some of our other depots that we're managing, it's sort of more like a factor 3 between the grid connection upgrade you would have needed compared to when you use a battery, then you typically need a connection that's about 3 times smaller.
Okay, we're on the roll with the technical questions. Have power quality issues such as harmonics been noticed at depot charging electric buses?
Depends on which chargers you're using. Obviously, harmonics is a huge concern for people on the network side of things, because obviously these things can have all sorts of impacts. But most chargers actually try to compensate for that themselves, because obviously otherwise they couldn't sell them as public charge points. But you do have that issue when things start clustering together, and again, but there are ways of mitigating that. So I would say it is an issue that needs to be looked at, but it's nothing insurmountable.
And one from Michael Smith at ACT Government, and thank you, Michael, for helping to facilitate and organise this, and also for your content that you're providing for our new buses section on the website. He's asking, could you please discuss options to optimise CapEx and OpEx? How could that reduce upfront cost barrier for e-buses versus diesel buses? Can you offer to buy the bus lease? Can you offer to buy the bus lease and battery? Yeah, so maybe just start with that. Can you discuss options to optimize CapEx and OpEx?
Yeah, and I think we sort of slightly expanding on what we were saying earlier. There are various options available there. So, for instance, leasing or using the batteries as a service is on the vehicle is one element, particularly also including any future replacement in that program. I think is quite important, because the longer the period you look at, the more competitive these things get. The financing then of the body can be done separately or sort of all wrapped together, and the same with the infrastructure. So we have seen all 3 of those combinations, and as Michael rightly points out, the capex substantially drops or falls away entirely, and is turned into an OpEx charge, which is handy, because then the cash flows of paying for the vehicle actually align with the savings of going electric. So you don't have that rather large hump to get over up front, which is obviously helpful. And I'm just looking at the chat, seeing the sort of follow-up question on that. Yes, does that make things competitive with diesel? From our work and the projects we've done, if you do sufficient miles or kilometers, I should say, then yes, that does make it competitive with diesel.
I guess a related question. Has there been any thoughts around retrofitting existing diesel buses? Have you seen that as a successful model anywhere?
We have seen that here in the UK, and I'm sure in other places as well. I think in the US there were a few very successful projects there. There's sort of 2 ways of looking at that. I think the one is the sort of small batch based approach, where you're looking at X number of vehicles, a handful, and doing it that way, in which case it's quite an intensive process. The other way is sort of what I haven't seen done yet, which I think is actually quite exciting, is if you were to do sort of larger batches, so you can actually set up a sort of proper assembly line approach, which would again bring the cost of retrofitting down. And the assessment there is effectively how much life have you got left before you need to do a major body overhaul. And again, looking at your drive and powertrain, about how much needs to be replaced. Are we just looking at going, say, from a hybrid diesel bus to an electric bus, or are you looking at going from a diesel to a hybrid, et cetera, et cetera? But I think there's definitely opportunities there. And the benefit of that is that, saying bringing in a new zero emission vehicle doesn't then lead to a non-zero emission vehicle being pushed to another route. You could actually have a double whammy where, 1 + 1 is 2 sort of thing.
Okay, I'm not sure. I think I've lost you, or perhaps you stopped speaking. But there's another question here around energy security and disaster mitigation. Around these, I guess they are critical infrastructure in many ways, as transport infrastructure. And if you're powering them with electricity, I guess there is a sort of a relative discussion to be had about that, which is a good question. I'm not sure, Stephen, if you are still there, but Gareth or Stephen? Oh, great, thanks.
I'm still here. Can people hear me? Or
we can hear now, yeah, but just cut off at the end. That's
okay, brilliant. Yes, I mean, good question. I mean, first one, the sort of slightly longer term view is the batteries we're taking off our buses, once they're sort of no longer meeting the operator's requirements, those are going into stationary storage to support on the grid or solve grid bottlenecks, which then also helps with energy security and that sort of side of things. You could look at doing that while they're still on the vehicle as well. The challenge with that is not just the battery on the bus, but the charging infrastructure, because most chargers today are set to run in one direction, which is from the grid into the vehicle. And the chargers that allow you to take energy off the vehicle and put it back into the grid often come with a larger upfront cost. But however, if you're in an area that's perhaps remote, has a weak grid, or is very prone to disasters, that additional cost may be worth it. So there have been projects done in the UK with looking at it more from an economical perspective, sort of trials around vehicle to grid and that sort of stuff, at least from what we've seen.
And have you seen much success with vehicle to grid trials in this space?
It's very early days, I would say, with the vehicle to grid trials that we've seen so far. So I think it's a bit early to tell. I think the challenge is at the moment the chargers are still quite expensive compared to the economic benefit that they generate. But then again, that's sort of an assessment that I think needs to be on a local level. Because, for instance, in the UK, that balance might not outweigh things. But I think in other markets, it has been more successful because the value of the service they can provide is a lot higher because the grid challenges are a lot higher.
Great. Well, I guess one final question is around policy and advocacy. So obviously the Electric Vehicle Council is a peak body of representing the industry in Australia, and a lot of people on the call will probably be from government of some sort. Do you have any kind of recommendations, either of you, around what we should all be, the language we should be using, and the I know you did touch on it, Stephen, but are there any other ideas about what the group and others should be pushing for in terms of opening up the market and making sure it's ready for this exciting, hopefully this exciting wave of change?
I'll start. So I think it's important, whilst a lot of the barriers are being broken down through a couple of the trials that have occurred across the world and in Australia, it's important to keep funding pilots and trials and get out the knowledge sharing and the information that comes out of these to break down the remaining barriers, and to make sure that we're educating people about what is actually a barrier and what isn't. And for example, talking about the grid related issues. Is it an issue, or can it actually be something that benefits the whole project? Is funding an actual impediment to the uptake, or can you leverage new financing models where you actually move that upfront capex into an ongoing OPEX stream, which is funded by savings? And another big issue which we're seeing, as people are saying, as a potential barrier, is space constraints. How do we deal with that? And again, there are ways around this. So it's educating people that it's when you hear the barriers that come up, you have in your toolbox things that you can talk about and examples of how these barriers have been broken down. And then the last point I'd say is environmental and emissions-based policies are really supportive and help with electric buses and electric vehicles, as you would all know. So I think the more of them that are out there and mandated, for example, in ACT, that then adds another weight to the story to transition to electric or zero emission vehicles.
Right, thank you. And Stephen, did you want to?
Very good point. So just one thing I would add, maybe two things I would add. One is grants are great, policies better. If you can, because the thing there is that, as I mentioned, this example of on one side subsidizing diesel costs and on the other side subsidizing electrics results in the government spending a lot of money, which in the end as tax paying people or corporations sort of circles through the system. Setting up a policy that is also achievable is helpful, because obviously it is a transition, and we need to be cognizant that operators and or public or private can't overhaul their fleets overnight, and it needs to be sort of done in a gradual, phased approach, so that you have time to look at things holistically and consider the infrastructure options, the vendor options. Is it hydrogen? Is it electric? What's the right mix? And plan these things ahead of time, so we can sort of lower the overall cost of the system and not sort of have knee-jerk movements where in some cases we may end up forcing people to overinvest or have things that aren't exactly fit for purpose.
Right, well, that's fascinating, and I think we're all very lucky to have heard from both of you today. And yeah, we'll obviously put you guys up on the website. This will be available, and people do want contacts with either. Let us know. So thanks again for attending. You can subscribe to this webinar on our website, which is chargetogether.org. And if you join the program, we have lots of webinars coming next year, some really exciting ones, such as IKEA, talking about their experience and some of their suppliers. So yeah, please join, and thanks again, everyone, for attending, and have a great holiday and festive season. And let's hope that next year it can be a big one for the electric vehicle industry in Australia. Thanks very much.
Thanks.